Not.
We're good?
I'm getting a thumbs up, so we're good.
Yeah, okay.
So this meeting will be video recorded and broadcast over local access channel 18 and through the town website at www.easthammass.gov. It's a little after 5. We have a quorum of the Finance Committee, so we're convened at 5:03. And before I introduce the senator, I'd like to recognize a number of guests. We do not have a quorum of Board of Selectmen, but Amy, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Martin may join us a bit later, and then we have Bill. Bill, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Bill is joining us from Germany, so that's quite impressive. And we also, I'd like to welcome Jim Russo, the head of the Eastham Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think I've taken care of everybody that I need to. And Jackie. But Jackie comes to all of our meetings, so I normally wouldn't think to say thanks, and also to Mike for joining us as well. I should also mention we have two new members of the Finance Committee. We have Yana Drake, who has joined us as our second meeting, and we have Brendan, who is our student member from the high school. Thanks for joining, giving up your time to be a part of our committee. So, with that, we're very pleased tonight to have State Senator Julian Cyr with us. He's nearing the end of his first year as our senator. He's a Truro resident. He is a graduate of Nauset High and New York University. Correct me if I get any of this wrong, but your chief of staff is right. So. He's currently the youngest senator in the 40-member body. He's the chair of the Joint Committee on Community Development and Small Business, the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Elder Affairs, vice chair of the Joint Committee on Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development, and serves on the committees with oversight of public health, housing, municipalities and regional government, environment, agriculture, and social welfare. Sounds like a lot of stuff.
Keep me busy.
Good. Over the past year, he's been focusing on a number of issues, and actually I think it matched up quite nicely with the letter that we exchanged with the senator before the meeting. And anyone who has joined us tonight, there actually should be copies of the letter that we exchanged with Senator Cyr if you'd like to follow along, because our meeting will probably follow that letter quite closely. But over the past year, Senator Cyr has been focusing on a number of issues, especially housing affordability, zoning reform, state support for wastewater needs on the Cape and Islands, preparing for the decommissioning of the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, and tackling the opioid epidemic. Then the last reference I should make is Representative Peake had hoped to join us this evening, but they unexpectedly had a session that will go into the evening that required her and all the other representatives to stay in Boston. So please join me in welcoming Senator Cyr to Eastham.
It's great to be here with you, and especially it's great to be here in this pretty spectacular library. It's definitely become, I think, my favorite public building in the district. And the district I represent stretches from Provincetown to Mashpee. It includes Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, actually the Elizabeth Islands, the little island of Cuttyhunk. So quite a diverse region. We've been actually made a real point. Many state representatives actually, and Representative Sarah Peake has really epitomized working with our towns. I think that there's very few issues that we advance at the state level that doesn't have some impact locally. And there's very few things that you folks get to do that don't run through Beacon Hill or some sort of state agency or bureaucracy in some way. So having been someone who, prior to this position, worked at the Department of Public Health for 6 years at the state level, really understands the interaction with each distinct 351 distinct local boards of health, have an appreciation for how much of a partnership we need there, and then also really seeing how Sarah's really made a point to go to all of our select boards. We've done that actually by the end of the year. I'll have gone before all the boards, in some cases with the finance committees as well, in some cases with the planning boards. But I do regret that Sarah isn't here, because usually we do these together and we make a really nice tag team. But the House is taking up some pretty important criminal justice reform tonight. The Senate did this several weeks ago. We actually stayed in to close to 1 a.m. To finish it. I don't know if the House will go that late today, but certainly Sarah's with us here in spirit. So just glad to be here. I also want to shout out, I think this is the most sophisticated form of remote access participation that I've seen under relatively new interpretation of the open meeting law and participation in that. And so really want to applaud Chairman O'Shea for joining us. Where in Germany are you, Bill?
I'm in Ludwigshafen.
Amazing. I don't even know where that is. But
It's near Mannheim. That's a bigger city.
Okay, yeah. I know that from some songs. Anyway, that's just terrific. So let's get into it. But really, just want to thank you folks for meeting with me. On some things I'll have some answers, and others will have to do some homework. And I think there's a part of it as well around having a conversation about, what the town is hoping to do, how we can support that, and vice versa.
So in chatting with the senator before the meeting, he informed me that of the meetings he's had like this on the Cape, the shortest has been 10 minutes. I won't say which town. It's 10 minutes. And the longest has been 2 hours. So I think we're shooting for about 6:30, a nice good time for a meeting. As I explained to the senator, we requested that in going through the discussion tonight that we had chopped up the topics in the letter and various members would effectively author or start that conversation. So at this point, Fred, I'll turn it over to you to start our conversation about potential health issues.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Senator Cyr, for coming tonight. Appreciate you coming. I guess I draw the straw on the health issues, and I guess I'll start by applauding you on the bill you have to strengthen the oversight for the post-closure of the Pilgrim nuclear plant. That's good stuff. But as long as the plant exists and is open and is managed by that entity or entity, it does present a clear and present danger to both the residents of the Cape as well as other parts of Massachusetts, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. I'm particularly concerned about Entergy since they're an out-of-state company. They really don't have any presence here on the Cape other than the plant itself. They have numerous safety violations. The track record with their nukes is abysmal. Of the three other of their nukes are in the same position as our nuke, in that they're at column 4, which is the next thing, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, next thing to actually forced closure. And they've had some cyber violations over there that concern me. And I don't think they have any plans to adopt the new regulations with respect to cybersecurity. It looks like they're just trying to skate this thing through until the closure, or the planned closure, I should say, in 2019. What really troubles me is that I read recently that they've rescinded 2 of their other planned closures. So they've gone back on their word to close 2 other nuclear plants. And I'm wondering if we're in that kind of the same situation. I mean, I know there's they say they're going to stick to the plan. So I'd like to know what, if anything, we can do on a more of a near-term basis to sort of push, and I understand about the ISO commitment and the penalty associated with it, but I'd still like to see it closed sooner than later.
Thank you, Fred. So I think you really nicely sort of summarized kind of where we've been with this corroding facility over the last several decades. I think one thing that I've realized both in my time in the legislature, but then prior, I worked pretty extensively on Pilgrim issues. Public health through the radiation control program has some oversight of the facility, and really have come to the opinion that this is a utility that is only motivated by one thing, and that's their bottom line. And so I and the delegation, my predecessor, Representative Peake and others, have really tried to target and craft legislation that impacts their bottom line, because that is something that the only thing that we know that they're going to respond to. So many topics that have been discussed in our communities before. When it comes to the plant closure, the 2 plants that Entergy, so Entergy actually has a number of plants that are in the queue to be decommissioned. They actually recently have begun the successful decommissioning process of Vermont Yankee. That is sort of a decommissioning that I'm watching closely, because I think how goes Vermont in this case may be what we'll be facing here. In the case of, I'm aware of one plant, and it's the Fitzpatrick plant in New York, that was slated for closure and that was brought back. That was part of a larger deal in the state around the closure of several other nuclear power plants, but keeping Fitzpatrick open, specifically around clean energy credits. I'm pretty certain that's not going to happen here in Massachusetts, and that's because the Department of Environmental Protection put out draft regulations as essentially what's going to qualify for clean energy credits. And initially, actually, I think the year that was used was 2014, which is something that a whole host of organizations had some concerns about. Now it's been talked to lower that to 2000, around the year 2000. We're getting nowhere near close to, I think it's 1973 when Pilgrim came online, so that Pilgrim wouldn't qualify for that. I'm pretty confident the plant is moving towards closure. Certainly, if anything changes, if I see any indication of that, I'll be very much the first to call that out. I think that it would require some sort of significant state action to keep them in operation. The reason these plants are broadly moving towards to closure and decommissioning, these old nuclear power plants, is they just can't compete in the natural gas market. And so actually the emergence of cheap natural gas has probably done more to close Pilgrim or move Pilgrim towards closure than anything else. I think what it also has meant that the utility is not invested in basic safety. I think their safety record is pretty abysmal. I mean, I know that it is. It's a statement of fact. But what I've been really trying to focus on is that how we conduct ourselves and how we go about closing and decommissioning this plant in the next several years will determine whether or not groups like this are talking about this plant for the next several years or the next several decades. The closure and decommissioning and how that's gone about is really critical. I actually filed legislation recently that 18 months ago the legislature established a citizens panel to have oversight over decommissioning. It's been my opinion that the panel does not have sufficient teeth, does not have, there's no representative of an independent government agency, so there's several representatives in the Baker administration and various health and safety and emergency response agencies, but the Attorney General doesn't have the seat. Barnstable County Emergency Services doesn't have a seat. And the other challenge for them is that they have no authorizing language from us, from the legislature in law, that allows them to receive dollars and receive appropriations and funds. And I really believe that you need to have some amount of resources here. By resources, I'm talking about maybe $50,000, $70,000 for this panel to bring in people to help staff their meetings, bring in outside experts and consultants. So that's sort of the latest push there on Pilgrim. I think certainly the long-standing work of many activists in our community around this plant, as well as the real uniform voice from our boards of selectmen in our towns around referendum on this, has also helped, I think, increase their cost of doing business when it comes to a whole host of additional things they've had to do in recent years, and I think is helping to contribute to the closure, the pending closure. But I think how we go about decommissioning is really, really important, and the most important thing from a risk perspective and from a health perspective is that Pilgrim move the spent fuel that's in this fuel pool. It's about 6 stories up, move that into dry cask storage immediately. I did meet with the utility relatively recently, and at least from the timeline I was given, there seems to be some positive movement in that direction. However, I think this is a case where you always have to keep on them. And again, our hands are a little tied here because from an actual authority perspective, all the activity that goes on around the plant is within the fence is regulated by the feds and not us. But I think increasingly, right, all of our interests are aligning, right? So whether you are a concerned citizen in Eastham who has been, wanting to see this plant closed since the famous Swim East T-shirt, came out in the early '80s and then it was reprinted in the 2000s, or you're a worker at the plant, having a swift and safe closure and decommissioning is now in everyone's interest. It's really in the interest of the town of Plymouth, which has a significant amount of land that's attached to real estate that's attached to this site. So I think we really got to keep our eye on the closure and decommissioning ball. And that's what I've really been trying to focus on, in addition to the accountability on a whole host of other fronts. Currently working actually and having discussions with the Department of Public Health to see if that they can increase certain standards that they have, so we can take into account certain radiation exposure at the plant, looking at several other components as well. But I think the decommissioning panel is our kind of best bet around determining what the future of this plant is going to be. And again, are we talking about this for a few more years, or are we talking about this as a risk to the region for longer than that? And I think longer is unacceptable.
Good, I agree. And I want to try to keep moving on this. The other issue on the health side is the herbicide spraying by Eversource on our vegetation under the power lines. And again, I applaud your efforts on your legislation about, I don't pretend to completely understand it, so I guess suffice to say, I prefer that they don't spray anywhere near our water supplies, which the aquifer is our only water supply. Not to mention, we're spending about $130 million on a water system here in Eastham that we'd really like to protect. But I'd like you to take a few minutes and explain the legislation you filed with respect to municipality, the utilities filing a plan with the municipality and negotiating a type of move forward plan for vegetation control, because I'm not sure that there isn't a shift of cost from the utility to the municipality in that.
So what the delegation, or what Sarah Peak and I have been focusing on, is again having sort of a multi-pronged approach when it comes to getting some movement around the application of herbicides, specifically glyphosates, in sole source aquifers, which is us right here. So I filed two bills. One is an act relative to vegetation management, and this is about providing an opt-out process for municipalities who do not want to see spraying in their communities. Many of the communities that I represent have not wanted to see this, including Eastham. I think your board has voted to support this and actually put some resources into litigation. And I can't be in Eastham and talk about this issue without recognizing Laura Kelly, who's an Eastham resident, who's been very dogged in pushing this. In that legislation, the goal has been to provide a menu of options to the Joint Committee of Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, which I sit on, and to say, all right, we have to do something around some sort of pesticide management. If we go the vegetation management bill that I've filed, essentially it allows towns to say, all right, we don't want spraying. We don't want to spray, and we'll enter an agreement where potentially we do take some of the costs involved around maintenance so that you don't spray. The other bill that I filed is Senate Bill 412, which is an act relative to the pesticide board. And if you look at how the pesticide board and how our pesticide regulations were established, this comes out of the agriculture industry, right? Agriculture. So pesticides traditionally were under the purview of agriculture and have been housed within the Department of Agricultural Resources since its inception. Increasingly, pesticides and pesticide-related exposure and concerns of that are becoming an environmental exposure concern and a human health concern. So if you look at the composition of the pesticide board, it's housed within the Department of Agricultural Resources. Public health and environmental protection do have a seat on the board, but it's agriculture, it's DAR that really drives the bus on the pesticide board. So the bill I filed relative to the pesticide board would give much more teeth to the public health representatives and the Environmental Protection Agency representatives on the board, specifically when an application comes to the board around application of herbicides in what's a sole source aquifer. So essentially that DPH and DEP would have to sign off on the application. Basically, it's a higher standard for the sole source aquifer. And the point there is the reason there's been hesitancy around this across the state is that rights of ways are used very broadly for, yes, for power lines, but also for highways, for rail beds, for the subway. So there is some concern that if you open up the right of way component, there could be a whole host of unintended consequences. And so what this bill tries to do is to acknowledge, we're most concerned about, we have one water source. Eastham, you folks probably know that better than any other town I represent. And so that we've got to be looking at potential health exposure and environmental exposure in a sole source aquifer differently. And so that's the aim of those two bills. Representative Fernandez, who represents Falmouth and the Islands, has filed legislation as well. So we're trying to get at this at different angles and at least move the ball forward. Speaking of poor corporate actors, I think Eversource, I would say, is not done the best job in its community engagement. They actually were spraying, this was anecdotal, but a constituent in Chatham documented them spraying on power lines during a very windy day. You're not supposed to spray if the wind's more than 10 miles an hour. I know that it's windier because I was actually around the corner at a cranberry bog. So it was one of those kind of windy days, so I don't have a lot of trust for them either. But that's how legislatively we're trying to get at this and just saying, look, give our communities have spoken. I hear a lot about this. Our communities have spoken a lot about this issue. Give us some avenue to address it, and that's how I'm trying to make some progress.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Art, if you could introduce the topic around tourism development, and we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes for this one, or we'll be completely off schedule, and the senator will be closer to his 2 hours. 10 minutes.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit later about economic development, but right now tourism is our economy. I looked at some numbers, and in terms of spending on tourism, Massachusetts about 20 billion, Cape Cod's about $1 billion. That's what they bring in, and that's roughly about 5%. And then if you look at employment and wages, there's about 135,000 people in Massachusetts dedicated to tourism. There's about 9,000 on the Cape, that's about 6%. Generate $4+ billion on the state level and $260 million on the local level, on the Cape Cod level in terms of wages. But what's really surprising is taxes. The Cape generates about 8% of the taxes in Massachusetts, about 106 million out of 1.3 billion. That's in state and local taxes. So tourism is our economy, and it's really important to us. What we worry about is the support we're getting out of Boston relative to tourism. The best example for us is a couple of years ago, the state decided they no longer were going to support the rest stop on Route 6.
Yep.
That's a rest stop and information center. Barnstable County took it over. Last year, Barnstable County was about to close it. That's a very, very important thing for us. And at the last minute, it was funded, but we really think the state should fund it. And I understand that Mass DOT has got an analysis underway now to look at reevaluating these rest stops and potentially starting some back up. So that's really important to us. When people start talking about the J-1 visa program, it scares the hell out of us. Because I know this past year we have had businesses that have had to curtail their hours because they could not get enough people to service the tourism industry and service the tourists that come here in the summer. So it's really appropriate that you're the vice chair of the tourism committee, because I personally, and I'm probably most of the people in this group, don't really know what the state is doing relative to helping Cape Cod in tourism, and whether there's dedicated resource and what we can do to work better together rather than making all the individual chambers of commerce or the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce drive this. We think the state should be driving this. So maybe you can tell us what they are doing and anything we can do to improve that.
So I think, first on tourism as economic development as a lifeblood of our economy. I mean, I get this at a sort of visceral, emotional, familial level. My family owned a restaurant in Truro for 28 years, a seasonal restaurant. I grew up in that business, and so, both appreciate what some very valuable things that having a seasonal economy and having some flexibility and owning your own business and the time that my parents and so many of our parents were involved in our upbringing, but also more importantly, the real challenges of, making your income over a few short weeks in the summer. And Massachusetts we've really dropped the ball on tourism. If you look at what we're spending on tourism, just from what we used to be spending, we are down. And moreover, what we're spending compared to other states, specifically other southeastern states, we're just losing market share. The Senate did try to make some reforms in our FY18 budget. specifically around requiring the governor to distribute funding to the regional transportation councils by sort of a certain date. Earlier in the first 2 or 3 years of the administration, the Baker-Polito administration was basically playing games with the money and not distributing it timely. That was not adopted in the final budget. But, you know, I've actually partnered with Secretary Jay Ash, who's the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, and a whole host of things. But for some reason, he doesn't, and the administration just doesn't seem to get how, you know, tourism isn't this nice-to-have thing, but is really the lifeblood of our economy, and I think is going to be, you know, not just for the near future. I mean, this, especially out here on the Outer Cape, this is what we've got, and there's just really not an appreciation for that. There's two ways that we fund primarily tourism in Massachusetts. One's through the Mass Office of Travel and Tourism. The governor actually slashed funding, overrode millions in funding for this. The legislature's restored it, but we're talking about $8 million to promote a state in a $40 billion budget. $8 million is a rounding error. The Mass Cultural Council has fared better, thanks in large part to a real concerted organization and advocacy effort, and their funding's up to over, I think now it's approaching 14 million in addition to their capital funds. It's supported a whole host of projects in our region. Again, the governor vetoed those, and the House and the Senate had to override them. So I'm really figuring out how do I make an argument to, especially the administration, to get them to understand that, you know, this isn't a nice to have issue, that this is this is our bread and butter, and that I think from a tourism perspective, we need tourism dollars specifically to work to lengthen the season. So how early are businesses open and how late they stay open. I've seen progress here in some communities. I think Nantucket and Provincetown have probably been the most successful of the communities I represent in really extending the season. But that's happened, you know, in Eastham and elsewhere. I mean, you know, it's a heck of a lot busier from a tourism perspective on the weekends and through the fall than it was when I was a little kid. I think we need to be doubling down on that, and it's really disappointing that the state, and specifically the administration, just doesn't get it. So any opportunities you have to sort of convey, you know, either as employees or as business owners, that's something that just they haven't seemed to get, and I don't know why. On the rest area in Barnstable, and so this is the rest stop if you're traveling east between exit 7 and exit 8. Exit 6 and exit 7. Actually, I was just reviewing a letter today that my office has drafted that we're sending to Congressman Keating and Senators Warren and Markey. We've actually had internal conversations both with the county and with the delegation and with MassDOT, and I think what we're seeking to do is to explore some sort of public-private partnership to have some sort of a facility on the site. It's clear that it is unlikely that the state is going to provide meaningful support for this, and the county is in a position, and so we think that a public-private partnership is the way to go here. More to come on that, but it's actually something, I had a meeting on this last week. We're sending out the letter later this week. It's from the whole delegation, so something we're hoping to drive. What I'm trying to do is to show good faith to the county that we're moving forward on this, ask them to maintain it for another summer, and then hopefully we could see some sort of, there'll have to be a bid process and what have you, but I think a public-private partnership is likely the way to go. Yes, at this rest stop, and then in others as well. You know, if you're the rest stop that's before the Bourne Bridge heading east, that's been shuttered for a number of years. I mean, it's pretty pathetic. And you know, this is something that I've been working to get my colleagues to appreciate. You know, on the J1 and H2B and broadly on workforce issues. You know, I lived this. I know how important and vital these programs are, especially with the H2B program. You have the same folks who come year after year, who really are kind of the engines that run your business, and who are really the people who actually have the most expertise, and the uncertainty of that program has given many of our businesses, kept them up late at night and provided a lot of anxiety. It's a very cumbersome process. So I've been working with Congressman Keatingson really on the J1 and the H2B issue. If you look at the interest here, you know, seasonal communities are all across the country, right? And so the Congressman's doing a great job working with Democrats and Republicans and trying to cultivate an appreciation for how vital the program is. I think that, and it's something that I've been supporting. Again, we're a little limited at the state level, you know, but really, I think when I hear sort of naive suggestions like, oh, well, you know, can't you just have a bus that runs from some off-Cape location? Clearly, those are individuals who've never worked in a restaurant or understand what's involved in our economy. So and you hear that from time to time. Definitely something that I was actually very concerned when there was, I think by the end of August, early September, the Trump administration, it may have even been the president himself via tweet, the J1 program had come up, and there was a lot of concern that that program would be scaled back or reduced. It's my understanding of that the Trump administration has walked back from that rhetoric, which is a real relief. I think if we had the double whammy of a continued restricted H2B program, increasingly our businesses have relied on the J1s because the H2B program has become more and more difficult. I think if we also lost the J1 program, I don't exactly know where we'd start. From a state perspective, I have had conversations with the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development around, you know, I think wholesale the idea of sort of bringing people here, it needs to be sort of thought out. Where I think there's most promise is around apprentice programs. So going to a culinary program, for instance, and saying, all right, do you want to come and work in Cape Cod, you know, in a kitchen for the summer? This is actually what my family, my dad taught culinary school for a number of years, and so would recruit students who were students who then would come, and actually several of them have stayed, and one of them actually married another employee, and now they opened a new business. So I think that's more along the lines of where we should be looking.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Senator. So continuing this theme, at this point, Jerry and Jackie have agreed to continue the discussion on other economic development.
Sure. Thank you. I think Jackie would like to give me the handoff mostly on this, so let's go. One of the things that we wanted to look at is we can't really have economic development if we do not have affordable housing for people to live here on Cape Cod. And we know that we've seen just in Eastham with the number of houses that are non-resident taxpayers has increased from around 50%, now it's 60%, and sometimes that goes up and down, but we have a situation where we have a huge demand in pricing because of the seasonal and recreational and beach push here, and the wages that are paid on the Cape are not enough for many people to afford. And we've looking at it in two ways. The first, initially, is looking at funding coming from the state for affordable housing, and using the definition that the state uses on affordable housing. We know Boston, Worcester, New Bedford, et cetera, all have major problems with housing, as well as Eastham and Western Massachusetts and the rest of the Cape. But it seems as though the funding for projects for affordable housing projects are going to large scale projects that we can't have, that Truro can't have, that et cetera. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've worked through the water, that you know, that there's some of the funding for water projects, there's a requirement in the state that 15% of that funding be held up for small projects. And I know our $130 million project is huge for us, but it's viewed as a small project. And so we're glad, so it may be that our thoughts are to look at funding for affordable housing within the state, to try and carve out a portion for small projects, 10 or even 2 or 3 in a duplex or a triplex, so that there can be some help for us. I mean, we really are in trouble in the sense that we have 1.9% affordable housing versus far from the 10%. But the second, so that's one thing that we thought, that maybe we can look at it the way the water is funded, to try and have a carve-out, not just for the Cape, but for more rural areas, for smaller projects. The second thing that we have is, as I alluded to, the wages are not enough for workers to afford housing here because of the great demand for non-residents. Residents putting on the prices of housing. And the state, in its formula, looks at the area median income, the AMI, and the affordable housing is way down at, if you're 30%, they're trying to push it. Whereas we have some problems from the Eastham standpoint, even going up to 125% of AMI to try and have people to afford housing here. So for any kind of economic development, for getting a business here, you need to have employees, and employees have to have some place to live. I mean, I wouldn't want to have them bus from off Cape on a Saturday or a Sunday in the summer, but whatever the case, we think that it probably behooves us, or to have you try and look and talk and say the numbers, using the cutoffs for AMI, maybe don't work in seasonal areas where there's a huge demand for second homes that push up the prices for housing, to try and maybe cut out a small piece of the pie to have a different set of regulations that might help not just Eastham, but all of us on the Cape and on the North Shore, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those comments. I think to start on the thread of economic development, and I very much agree with you that I think if you look at the infrastructure need that we have in the region from a not only something economic development perspective, but just simply from a sustainability perspective, housing is it. You know, I was just meeting with Tom Conrad earlier today. You know, if you look at the enrollment numbers in our communities within the Nauset district, you know, school choice has been tremendously helpful for this district. But that is a function that people, frankly, cannot afford to come here. They can't do what my parents did and their generation did, right? It was nothing special to open a seasonal business, a restaurant, or a motel, or, you know, that work in the trades, construction, right? That's nothing, that was not a special, unique thing when I was growing up. And to be able to do that today, you either need to have some sort of foothold here, or you have to have significant independent wealth, and frankly want to lose a lot of that, right? Because these aren't profitable, big, you know, you're not making a ton of money doing this stuff. You know, and so that's the driving factor, I think, about whether or not this is a sustainable region, at least, you know, for the, I don't know, 500 or so years we've got before it goes into the ocean. You know, I think more broadly in economic development, before I get on housing, because that's quite a soapbox for me, you know, I've been really trying to look at how do you support small business more broadly across the state. There's a terrific small business technical assistance grant program that the CDP here in Eastham runs. I was able to get $2.5 million in funding for that in the Senate budget. Really something I think is really something I really believe in and support. I'm also a member, the Senate President has tasked several senators as being part of a retail task force, excuse me. So task force to look at the challenges that retailers have across the state. Part of this is in response to sort of how increasingly, actually much to the delight of outer Cape Codders, you can now go online and go to Amazon opposed to driving to Hyannis to purchase a whole host of things, but also looking at retail from a Main Street perspective and from a tourism perspective as well. We're actually going to be here on the Cape on December 4th. We have a panel of senators who are coming down as part of this task force to look at that. So I don't want to I want to acknowledge the other pieces on economic development that we're working on. I think the other piece that's huge for economic development and where state government works best in economic development is infrastructure, right? So water, we're talking about. Wastewater probably is the infrastructure need of the region. I can talk about that a little later. So I wanted to acknowledge those pieces, then also tourism promotion. I think when it comes to housing, we are so far gone, and our real estate market is so out of whack that whether you're a town like Eastham, which is just getting to about 2% of that technical affordable, or you're a place like Provincetown, which already has 10% affordable housing. The current sort of structures and formulas and what the state has put together just aren't really a fit for our needs. I like to really talk about attainable housing or workforce housing. I think affordable housing is critically important, but that has to be mixed in with workforce housing. And really, there's so we're taking up a housing bond bill. We do this every 5 years, and this is the legislature authorizes all the capital projects that can be taken up for housing. And I sit on the housing committee, and the joint committee that I chair on community development and small business has planning and zoning issues. So I'm talking to my colleague who's the chair of the housing commission, committee, and he says, oh, there's gonna be all this great stuff for like workforce housing, in there, up to 120% of AMI. And I'm like, that doesn't do much for the communities that I represent, particularly communities on the Outer Cape, particularly communities on the islands. And so I think we've got to really be, I'm going to try to push to have some form of either small scale or attainable housing or something that takes into account our needs. That being said, and I should also say that there is a push to look at housing production and zoning reform. On Beacon Hill, I'm part of these conversations. There's a small working group of several senators that is really trying to push this. This is something my predecessor championed on the zoning reform piece. I've really added the housing production piece to it, and this would include mandating communities to have multi-development, mixed development, multi-unit development, prioritize communities to have accessory dwelling units, require even looking at the thresholds for zoning changes. Right now you've got a 2/3 vote. That's a really high hurdle for developers. If you look at our zoning system, it's all designed. So if you really want to be honest about what home rule is about, this is actually something that was put into response in the 60s and 70s in response to civil rights. And zoning is a tool where we get to decide as a community who's in our community and who isn't. And what's happened here is that that's gotten kind of out of our control, and actually here on the Cape, we're not going to be able to have any communities if we don't change how we do business and don't change our zoning. Most of the communities that I represent, and actually Eastham's an outlier here, you guys are a little different, but most of the communities I represent have a relatively dense downtown, whether it is Wellfleet or Orleans or Chatham or Harwichport or all the villages in Barnstable, Nantucket. You could not, Eastham and Truro are outliers, but you could not build those what we think of as quintessential Cape Cod communities under current zoning. And add to that for better or worse, or for worse probably, our communities opted against, looking at wastewater solutions when it was cheap to do several decades ago, or cheaper, there was more incentives to do. And so, I think it's really important that we hammer home, and I do this all the time, or try to, that 1 acre and 2 acre zoning with a Title V septic system not only is fundamentally unsustainable to our, from a demographic perspective, from a construction, from just a development perspective, what makes sense dollars-wise, and it's irresponsible environmentally. And so, I think we have to be honest that the way out of this is that we do need to build in specific locations in our communities, and I feel very strongly about this. And I think that we need to be making it, part of that is going to be tied to infrastructure. It needs to be a regional conversation, right? Yeah. So again, Eastham, Truro are outliers here, but you're talking about, communities not very far away, looking at how do we, from a state perspective, how do we help on the $4 billion wastewater problem, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But increasingly, there's a lot the state can do, and I want us to do a better job in providing tools that meaningfully say, all right, we have an opportunity to build, 12 units, which is a big project, right, for some of our communities. Had to get some support there. We got to do a better job on that. But I also think it would be dishonest of me not to highlight that a lot of the solutions to these problems could be found within our own towns. It's about changing our own zoning that we do have the authority to do. And so, you know, I think as much of this as we can make happen at the local level is just as important. And I would look to places like, you know, it's hard to look at places like Nantucket or Provincetown, which are so far gone that they're actually, you know, Provincetown's actually getting into the business of purchasing and maintaining through a trust mechanism, you know, middle income housing. On Nantucket, there's actually talk of doing something similar, though using an excise on property tax sales. So in a place like Eastham, and especially in places in the Mid-Cape, which aren't, you know, which are going this way, how do we figure this out? And I think that a lot of these solutions are at the local level. And what I fear is that no matter what we do at the state level, that this sort of persistent, that the advantages of a real process-driven system, the advantages of litigation, and the advantages of this not in my backyard will just continue to stifle development. I mean, in my opinion, this is what's holding back Massachusetts. And this is what's holding back, you know, and the Cape's in a specific demographic piece, but look more broadly, you know, this is the state that educates more people. We have a vibrant economy. Our economy is booming. What do we not have? We don't have housing. Why are people leaving the state? Because it costs so much darn money to afford to live in Greater Boston. You know, why are people unable to do, why is my generation unable to do what my parents' generation did? It's the cost of housing. Why am I able to here, and the young folks that you see who are here, why are we here? It's because our families have a foothold here. This is not a sustainable way to go about having a future. And I think when we also talk about housing, you know, yes, we're talking about millennials and younger folks being here. We also need to talk about having housing for step-down housing or housing that folks can downsize to. So, I mean, my parents are in this boat where, you know, my parents have this, like, you know, really lovely Greek Revival home. You know, it's a heck of a lot of work. They're, you know, jokingly at this point, sick of it. But you know, I think if we had a real conversation about, you know, hey, we want to downsize. Well, there's nowhere to downsize to. I mean, I know folks who have left Wellfleet, active people left very, very active couple, left Wellfleet from New Bedford because they couldn't find anything that would fit their needs here. So I'm going on a bit of making a bit of a speech on housing issues. So yes, absolutely, Jerry, you know, I'm gonna be working on this housing bond bill. I think is an opportunity. I think zoning reform is an opportunity. We're working on that. And I know you guys are working on this here, but I think the only way that we'll get at this is if we work in partnership. And I will just end and really encourage folks, if they haven't seen the housing study put out by the Cape Cod Commission, this is a really helpful roadmap to the amount of units that are needed in each of our community. We need we need to build 26,000 new units just to sustain a year-round population here. That's across Cape Cod, so that number is a lot smaller on the Outer Cape than it is in the Mid-Cape. But really encourage people to take a look at that.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate your thought of one size, your state formula, one size doesn't fit all, and I hope that we can try and get that and put some pressure on us to get our locals, if you think we're not there, working on it to do that. Peter, you were...
Said one quick question about, is there any discussion at all about any kind of modifications to 40B? Because 40B isn't really that helpful to our situation in Eastham.
Yeah,
And actually, it can be damaging, especially where, you know, 25% only has to be affordable. We just don't have the land, so it's encouraging more development, but we don't get that many affordable houses out of it. And plus, the income levels are so low that we don't get our workforce housing, and so really, it's not a great thing for Cape Cod.
40B, so there's not too many conversations about opening up 40B, because I think 40B when you're talking about like more controversial protections, there's always a concern that opening that up is going to lead to a whole host of unintended consequences. I think the more important conversation with 40B, and I talk about this, is that this really isn't, it really isn't a fit for, I don't want to say it's not a fit for our communities. It doesn't really actually get at the need that we have.
Right.
Actually, for a lot of developers, it's just not worth doing here. The numbers just don't add up from a 40B perspective. And so what I'm more interested in is, well, how do you have other alternatives that can be used and leveraged? 40B is designed to work well when you're having, you're building a 400 unit development next to transit. 40B works well. When you're in these smaller communities, it just doesn't sort of add up. And so how else do you figure out incentives for developers? And I've had conversations with some developers here on the Lower Cape and elsewhere who really want to do, they're like, I want to develop this property. I want to build, affordable and workforce housing. The numbers don't add up. And so the real challenge, and I think what the state has to come up with, is sort of how do we fill that need? So I think the 40B conversation is, I think there are some examples where 40B has been, successful on the Cape, and I think we'll continue to see those, right? And then that'll continue to exist. But how do you meaningfully have tools that are much more fits for our needs? And you folks have spent a lot of time talking about this stuff, but I think that that's what I'm trying to figure out, is sort of like, all right, what else, if we're going to be taking this up, if we really want to be talking about workforce housing, then just having something that's basically paying attention to people who are 30% of area median income up to like 120% of area median income, that still is taking those folks from 120% up to 200%, who are putting pressure on the existing units that we have, and who are really continuing to push out folks, affordable units, right? So we've got to find a way to that's the missing piece of that, if that makes sense.
Jackie, I think you had a few additional elements within that.
Not really. I think Jerry hit on my issues. I guess I see us potentially having, 120 new units of affordable housing here in Eastham in the next 2 years.
Wow.
Perhaps, because we have 2 developments that are proposed. However, that's going to give us maybe 20 units of housing over 80% of AMI, and most of it will be 30% or below. So to imagine that for we have 90 jobs, or we can support 90 families on under $30,000 a year. I don't know where they're going to work, and I don't know how that's going to help us get firemen and teachers and policemen housing that have the little kids that we want. So we want the little kids, we want the young families, and I think that certainly the affordable housing units that we'll develop will get some of that.
Yep.
But it's just, you're right, we just need more tools. And I see, when I talk to the developers, I see a lot of concern around the funding formulas and what the state incentivizes and the tax credits. And they get points and they get certain things for developing under 30% or under.
Yep.
And so I guess I just feel like that may be great for Cambridge, but for the Outer Cape, it's going to be increasingly hard to try and develop more affordable units.
Yep.
And think that we're going to really be serving our region, because
I point to,
we're looking at residents from Provincetown and
well, exactly.
Truro.
I mean, Provincetown has 10%. It hasn't meaningfully made it's helped. Certainly it's helped, some individuals, but, I think that we have to, when we're talking about affordability, and even when we're publicly talking about affordable housing, right, people have a certain kind of perspective on what that is. Mm-hmm. And really this is sort of, I don't know how else to say it, but it's sort of, it's like, well, it's just like regular housing, but we don't have any, I'm struggling with the right term here. I've been using like attainable housing. But I think you're right. Part of the challenge with the tax incentives is that that's something that is bought and sold and traded not only just sort of at a state level, but it goes more broadly. And so then that gets into, that's the appeal.
Yeah.
But we're definitely looking at, I mean, I'm very much interested in and have been looking at opportunities to say, all right, if we know we have a workforce housing issue in the Commonwealth, right? This is not just, we have a certain flavor of it here in the region, but housing and housing production is a major issue, of many of my colleagues, especially in Greater Boston. And I know this is an issue because my, peers and friends are living it as well. But I think for smaller communities, and it's actually not even smaller communities, for communities where, area median income, just going up to 120% of area median income, that's not meeting our needs. Is there another designation that's even created for that? I don't know. It's something that I've been thinking about. And I think that I also really want to take a look at what's actually in this housing bond bill, because when you actually read it and say, all right, you look at it and you try to find where the holes are, and then you try to fill it in.
So the next topic, I suspect, will be very dear to the senator's heart, in particular in the summer as he goes back and forth between Boston and the Cape Cod. So Art, I'll turn it back over to you for Cape Cod access egress.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't say time limit, because this is a subject we could talk about for the next 3 days. Obviously, Route 6. There's two areas that I really want to talk about. The first one is getting on and off the Cape. The changes in the entrance to the bridges have made a difference, but still, that road backs up. It's a logistical non-starter for a business that wants to locate on the Cape, because they just, from a transportation standpoint, they can't afford the kind of backups and waits that they would have. So lots of talk about a third bridge, but I haven't heard anything that says, how do you improve the entrances and the exits from that bridge? Because if you just stick a third bridge in, I don't think it's going to help. Okay, so that's very, very important to address. The other thing is what Route 6 does to Eastham. It cuts our town in half. You could not legally build Route 6 if you tried to do it today. We have a 40-mile-per-hour speed limit, but guess what? There's very, very few people that do 40 miles an hour. And we have a great police force, but they don't have the resource to continually monitor that road to slow people down. So it's something, we're going to address some of that in our DCPC process over the next 8 months or so, in terms of looking at the 100 curb cuts we have between Orchard Road and Nauset Road, and see what we can do, and maybe get some feeder roads on the side. But the long-term process, or what we need to do in the long term, is find a way to take Route 6 and make it attractive, more efficient, less of a speedway, and have us have a town that's not bisected by that road. The urban myth, and I've heard it a number of times now, so that I really believe it is, when you try and work with Mass DOT, really, really difficult. You can get things done, but you got to be up in Boston continuously, putting a lot of pressure on them. So I think, I don't know that there's anything you can dress on this, but I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we need a task force with the state to help us find a way to take Route 6 and change it from what it is, and make it a more attractive, more efficient road.
So on getting off and on Cape, and I do spend a lot of time not only thinking about it, but doing it. Though I will say, during the summer months, I try to take the ferries out of Provincetown because it's a 90-minute ride that you're not having to drive versus hours and hours and hours of traffic. MassDOT and the Army Corps of Engineers have been studying the whole canal region, and I think that there's some other low-hanging fruit that I'm trying to push forward more immediately. The actual bridges themselves are under the auspices of Army Corps of Engineers. I actually really believe, these are 2 of the 3 oldest bridges that Army Corps has anywhere in the country, and these bridges are just bridges that need to be replaced. They were built in, during the New Deal, and my perspective is, not a third bridge, just a replacement bridge. And so I'd really like to see them be doing that. I think having I think that given the volume we're always gonna have a little traffic here, but, you know, having replacement bridges, in my opinion, is the way to go. I think there's some other low-hanging fruit that are gonna make things better. Commuter issues, I hear about a lot. Commuters have increasingly used not only exit 6 lot, but also in Hyannis. There is land available off exit 2 in Sandwich, and that we think that I'm working to explore with my colleagues. Is that an option around expanding commuter access? I think the Cape Flyer has been successful and something we really should be expanding. Again, this is making less of a difference for folks who live out in our neck of the woods, but more broadly for the region. If you were going to expand commuter rail service anywhere in the Commonwealth, the place you could expand it and do it most cheaply would be here to the Cape. Again, Hyannis and Bourne. I don't think that's coming to Eastham anytime soon. But I think that those pieces, as well as the expansion of ferry service, so I don't know if folks have noticed, but one of the ferry companies in the province have actually expanded service on weekends past Columbus Day. And I think my understanding is it's been successful. And so I think all those are avenues that, particularly in relieving the congestion that we have, the more folks we can get here, not via Route 6, the better. As far as Route 6 here in Eastham, I have spent my whole life driving on this road. When you live in Truro, you spend a lot of time, especially when I was growing up, going through Eastham to Orleans, going to Eastham to school. And it's always been kind of a really challenging, frightening road. And add to it that you have in the really busy months, in the no locals who are using your back roads to avoid it, and it's a real burden on the town. Sarah Peak has championed and I think been able to get resources for the town around traffic enforcement. I think that's important. I think really looking at the curb cuts and how do you change the built environment around the road is something that I think is good to look at. I don't know if I have too many good answers. I'm trying to think of where else in the Commonwealth that they've had these sort of 4-barrel lane roads where you've seen a sort of significant change. I'm also wondering if, I know there's a lot of talk around development around Brackett Road, and does that kind of create more of a town center for the town? But Route 6 is tough, and so I would just say, however I can support you folks, in that, I think that in my experience with MassDOT, they are often most reticent just when it comes from like a resource perspective. But I think the more things that are driven by the town, especially around looking at that curb cut piece and how do you redirect or close up or redirect folks. I think that could be, it's tough because a lot of the most sort of successful businesses have been built on Route 6 and they rely on that. So, it would be a hard conversation to, be like, look, you can't take a left into Arnold, right? That might not go well, but I think that kind of conversation is important. So if you folks have ideas or requests from us around having a task force or something like that, often in this position, it's sort of serving as a liaison. And so I'm glad to do that however I can. And I think I certainly would rely on Sarah because she's been dealing with this from a policy issue. I think the rumble strips have made a difference. I think the speed limit, certainly it is known. As a resident of Truro, it is known that you do not go as fast in Eastham as you do in Wellfleet. Once you hit that Wellfleet border, it's a different environment. But I think that's good. I think culturally people understand that you should be slowing down. But I realize it is a big burden on the town. And, however I can assist, I'm glad to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for inviting the Board of Selectmen, and really appreciate Julian coming and talking to us tonight. So I'm just going to piggyback on what Art started with Route 6, and to say that MassDOT is uncooperative is an understatement. I had a 3-year break on the Board of Selectmen. I was on for 6 years, and then I've been off for 3, and now I'm back on. In 2012, the Cape Cod Commission did a study for us to put in a traffic light, well, a pedestrian/bicycle crossing light at Governor Prince for Fort Hill. 2012. All the studies were done, the approval, the National Seashore put up the money to fund it, so there's no tip money, there's no state money, anything. All the approvals are in except Mass DOT since 2012. In January, the selectmen sent yet another letter, I believe, to Mass DOT trying to get this approved. Crickets. We've heard nothing. Scott Bosworth was at the Selectmen and Counselors Association meeting on Friday, and I kind of put it on his radar.
Yep.
He knew nothing about it because it isn't shown on the tip or anything else because the seashore is putting up the money. So if there's
Is
any...
that money still there from the seashore?
Yes,
If you can send me that letter that you sent,
absolutely.
I will send it to me. Has Sarah tried to intervene on this before?
She has.
Yeah.
Is she?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not recently, though. I don't think we've asked her recently.
Send me the letter. I'll coordinate with Sarah. And often, so I actually dealt with MassDOT most recently in Truro. There was a off Route 6. Truro, actually, there was plans to have a clover leaf in North Truro, which is kind of absurd. But so anyways, it meant there's state land available. There was a process to take that land, and of course it was mirrored in a little bit of bureaucracy, and was able to put some pressure and get some movement, and we got it done. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And I think
glad to.
on top of that, you know, talking about Route 6 and all the problems we have, really there are great models under Complete Streets that address all of our issues. The left turn issue, the pedestrian and bicycle access issue. I mean, half of our highway is not accessible to pedestrians and bicyclists. I don't know if you saw the article in the Times today about the gentleman in Eastham who was in a wheelchair and has a really difficult time. He has a dog, he has a service dog. He can't get to the Cape Cod dog across the highway. There are no sidewalks over there. You know, it's like an island over there to people on, my daughter worked at the Red Barn Pizza. She couldn't ride her bike. She had to get a ride. You know, I mean, it's just,
You know,
it's ridiculous.
my campaign office was in that plaza in Main Street Mercantile, and so I very much appreciate the lack of accessibility there. And I think, you know, I'd always be like, oh, like let's just go get something at I want to go get something at Sam's Deli, and you know, there was some conversation like, well, is there a back way we can go? And I think I actually I had the audacity to walk it once on the highway, and it was
Scary.
It's frightening. Yeah.
yeah, and it's all full of poison ivy, and so I'm walking behind the barrier.
Well, even this study that they did at Fort Hill about the light, the state came down, you know, to survey it and look at it, and it even says in there, no one that was here visiting dared try to cross the highway. There's no pedestrian crossing there now, but it's 4 lanes, and there's just, even in the winter, you know, cars come flying around the corner, you can't see them,
Yep.
and you're risking your life trying to get across the highway. So anything you can do to help us when really what this DCP is kicking it off, but really the whole 7-mile stretch needs to
Yep.
be addressed, because we don't need a 4-lane highway through our town. I mean, it's 2 lanes coming in, it's 2 lanes going out. You know,
Yeah.
it seems ridiculous that we have to expand to 4 lanes in the middle.
Yeah.
Slow it down, reduce it. It's called a road diet, actually. You go to 4 to 3 lanes. Put some bike lanes in, some sidewalks, and, you know, we'll actually get more people off the road that way. People
Yep.
will be able to bike and go out to lunch, or bike and go to the beach and safely get across the highway.
Has there been some look at on the traffic implications? I mean, I know sort of in recent memory, Wellfleet has become this real bottleneck where, and I'm just not talking about the traditional bottleneck of sort of going up where the movie theater is, but the Marconi lights, and then actually further to the other set of lights. And it's really something I've noticed was never used to be a problem when I was younger. And now, you know, it's kind of the sense that you want to manage it so you don't go south of PJ's kind of thing. You know, so interesting to look at that. I think that should be part of the conversation, but I think on a piece that you've got to look at the traffic from the Rotary up until basically you get to that point in Wellfleet. I think there's been increased utilization in the summer months. I think we've done a good job of getting people to come out here more and more. So how do you really meaningfully improve things in Eastham?
And it may take them, 3 minutes longer to get through Eastham, but, maybe they'll be alive on the other end of it.
Yeah.
Instead
No,
of now.
it's-
I mean, we had at least four med flights this summer, and one individual I think is still in critical condition. I don't know if he's still gonna make it, and we lose probably a couple people a year
Yeah.
average. I mean, that's ridiculous.
So has there been a so you're gonna do the DCPC, and is there gonna be a study?
The
Okay.
commission, yeah.
The commission will do-
And we actually just got
The
a,
whole piece of road, not just.
Right.
Not just a section, so
we
the
actually
whole
did
piece?
get a complete streets grant. Glenn Cannon just told
Yep.
me the other day that we got one to do the whole thing, look
Yep.
at the whole McGilla, but that's just to study it,
Yep.
not,
And-
for the improvements.
And when you folks were doing the water project, was there any look at using that? Because the road was sort of totally opened up then, but you didn't really have the authority to do that, right?
No.
There's some improvements in sidewalks and stuff.
We need
but-
to move on to other topics, unless Jackie, you
I
have
just want
something.
to say one thing, not to beat the DOT, because we just had a meeting with the DOT, and we're having several of them, and there's going to be many more. It's a huge bureaucracy. They have tremendous responsibility and very few resources, I think, to actually fix what they need to fix.
Yeah.
So, given that, I understand their limits, but I had to tell them how many thousands of cars go over our road every day, because they were, in this last meeting that we had, they were like, I don't know why the road settled so much. And I'm like, 30,000 cars a day. And they're like, really? It's that many? Yes, it's that many.
Even in the off-season?
No.
No,
No, but still.
thank you. Well, send that over to us, we'll work on that. We'll at least work on getting an answer on Governor Prince.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the last topic in our letter covers unfunded mandates, but before we go to that topic, Russ French reminded me over the weekend that the cost of health insurance in the town has been a topic for at least the last 2 or 3 years when we considered the budget, and I discussed it with the senator before the meeting. He's quite happy to talk to that area, something he's knowledgeable about. So Russ, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Senator, for joining us tonight. And I know this is an area of interest to you, because just on November 11th in the Cape Cod Times, there was an article on healthcare in there, which you were working on, which may save Massachusetts on mass health, which is Medicaid, about $114 million, and on overall healthcare costs by 2020 between $475 and $525 million. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that we've really ever directed our attention to the cost issue as versus enrollment. And I am very appreciative of it. And you also had a bill on there which to have a study to cost to implement a single-payer healthcare system. And if I count the votes right, you may have even gotten a few Republican votes on that. But my concern, which is for the town, and I've been working on this for at least 5 to 10 years, is the potential, by going to GIS, of reducing the Barnstable County Blue Cross Blue Shield plan and I've had zero success. And it is the biggest cost driver for the increase to our budget over the last, since 2005. The increase has been $1.2 million. Now, the Blue Cross Blue Shield plan, which is a for-profit plan, versus the GIC, has some scale of economy disadvantages. There are only 30,000 employees in the Barnstable plan versus 300,000 to 400,000 in the state plan. So my assumption is that there is money to be saved. I've heard anecdotally that Massachusetts town off Cape have switched to GIC for serious cost savings. I was sitting with a woman at the Hole-in-One Saturday when I found out that she's a special ed teacher in Wakefield and worked on a committee on the cost of insurance. They had Blue Cross Blue Shield. They switched to the GIC plan and have saved a lot of money. I'm waiting to hear back from her, a more definitive number on it. But she liked the plan better after it started. She said there were 7 to 8 plans. The drugs cost less than it did on the Blue Cross Blue Shield, and it covered all the same doctors. So there was no disadvantage to it. Recently, the Cape Cod Times, August 22nd, ran an editorial titled "Joint Group Plan" by Bill Mills. The last sentence states, "The savings would free up millions for other priorities, benefiting every resident, including the employees." And he's talking about Cape Cod. Yeah. And it was answered by the same people that run the Barnstable County plan with the same issues that I got when I tried to go after this. So my question is, I have no way of doing an apples-on-apples comparison in terms of the cost. In other words, I know that the towns save money by going to GIC, but we have a plan that covers, 14 towns on the Cape Cod? And there could be savings beyond what an individual town has. And I'd like to know, is there any possibility that there is a cost savings if we could have a real comparison? Because it's going to be a very difficult thing to get through, because everybody loves their plan. Everybody is scared of changing, particularly in these times with where the Republicans are going with it. And but I think it's worth, if we can find some way of doing it. Your problem and Sarah's problem is going to be that you may have some blowback at the, when you go into an election.
We need to move forward.
So, Russ, thank you. I hear from every town as to what a struggle this is. I can talk about the broader healthcare reform efforts a little later, but you should know, before my time in the legislature, law allows municipalities to opt into the GIC, albeit for future employees. There is some concern about, there's a real issue of what your retiree benefits are. I have GIC health insurance and had as a state employee, and now have as an elected legislator. I think it's great. I certainly appreciate what the county's been able to, we've been able to do sort of countywide, but I'd really say, encourage you folks to look at it. If my office can be helpful in reaching out to the GIC just to give you a cost estimate, glad to do. I think more and more getting in together helps to save healthcare costs, and I think it's something that makes sense. A lot of other municipalities have done it off Cape, and they find some benefit to it. I think one of the island communities it represents also is in the GIC. So I can get some more information on that. In bringing up healthcare, we did just have a really big healthcare debate around cost containment in the Senate. We have a $59 billion healthcare market here in Massachusetts, and we spend a significant amount of money of those dollars are public dollars. As you mentioned, I was pretty excited about being able to get a single-payer benchmark study into the bill. So essentially, this has the state study the cost of what a single-payer system would be and compare that to the existing costs of our system. If it's cheaper, we have a roadmap to go towards that. I think GIC is an example. Our mass health program, Medicare is an example of how we go about doing this. I look at what it costs today and what it's projected to cost, and these are really big numbers, and I don't know where that's all gonna come from. But I was really encouraged in the Senate, a vote of 35-3. Yeah. Republicans, conservative Democrats, and just saying, hey, look, we've got to study the issue. There's got to be a better way, and it may very well be that single payer is not the way to go. Vermont put its toe into this and did not have a successful implementation. I I think the other piece in unfunded mandates, and I do want to mention this before I go, and this is something that Sarah Peak deserves a tremendous amount of credit for getting us so far, and that's expansion of short-term room occupancy, or expansion rather of the room occupancy tax to short-term rentals like Airbnb, VRBOs, and short-term rentals. This is something that we're confident it's going to move. The Senate has actually acted on this twice. The Speaker of the House has said that he is willing to move on this, and so we're hopeful that we'll be able to do this by the end of the session. For your communities, this is going to mean, I believe Eastham has a 4% local option.
We did pass it.
Yeah.
But obviously home rule.
With home rule. So if this would go in, this would be significant monies coming into your town. Just probably for the communities I represent, this would be the biggest sort of infusion of local aid that we'd see in quite a while. We also think that this is an avenue for us to provide a way to come up with state support for the wastewater challenges that we have. So we've got a $4 billion problem across Cape communities. We are under court action. We have to do something about this. And if we don't do something about this, we will be required to do so by a court, and will cost a heck of a lot more than $4 billion. And so what we think is that with expansion of room occupancy, that if you look at the costs that we have and the systems we have to build systems for the peak of the season, those peak several months, really July 4th, last week in July, first 3 weeks in August. And so how do the people who are contributing to that, how do they pay into that? If this is solely on backs of property taxes and betterments, you think we're profoundly unaffordable and it's hard for folks to make it here now. And that's a hard argument to make, because I go to budget writers in Beacon Hill and they say to me, relatively our communities have lower tax rates than elsewhere. But this is something we're really excited about. I've proposed the creation of a Cape Cod Water Protection Trust, that this would be a place where those monies could be funneled so that towns are able to leverage dollars, not just on their own borrowing limit, also be able to collaborate with the Treasurer's Office and the existing state revolving loan fund and water projects fund that they have. So this is a really exciting big opportunity, probably most immediately would benefit communities like Orleans, but also here in Eastham. We think Wellfleet's going to need to do something, and then elsewhere on the Cape where there's really big projects. But I think that this is, I'm increasingly optimistic that this is something we'll be able to get done. I've had really significant support from the business community. It's the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce that's really been leading the push here in tying wastewater as a vital piece to our. Yep.
There's a big section on mandates. We hope to get you to weigh in extensively on that. But one short follow-up.
Yeah,
That's why I just wanted to mention the wastewater piece. It's really important.
I just wanted to,
Julian, one sec. While you're on the subject of wastewater, it's our understanding that two areas that we have, one is Town Cove and the other is Salt Pond. And Salt Pond, there really aren't any houses around there, so it's not from septic system.
We have a whole section on that in the next section. If you can hold off for a second.
Okay. All right.
Julian, I just wanted to mention that I went to Bill Mills, who's one of the editors at the Cape Cod Times, and I asked him, about that article, do you have any numbers that I can use? Because that's the only way that it's going to be possible to sell it. And he said, no, I really don't, but if you go to GIC and talk to them, they may be able to do it. Well, I've been to GIC, and I'm not able to do it. Not probably because I don't understand it, or I'm not articulate enough, but I can't get a apples to apples comparison to see if we can save money. That's what I need.
We are glad to help on that. It may just need to be a letter or some sort of formal request.
Right.
Of course, it'd probably be an estimate, but maybe you'd get like apples to pears at least, yeah.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you, Russ, for raising it.
So, Bill, let me give just a very quick intro, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you could pick up with what you were saying a minute ago.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so the issue on Route 6, Julian, is, our understanding at least, is that the big part of the problem with Salt Pond is the runoff water from Route 6 into Salt Pond. informed that the state has exempted itself so that they take no responsibility for helping correct that problem, and it's probably the biggest cause of nitrogen load in Salt Pond. And one I want to know is that in fact, because I talked to somebody else and they said there's a federal law, federal mandate for that would cover that, and that the state is liable for that, for complying with that federal law. So I'm a bit confused. I mean, they are definitely contributing greatly to the problem, and I would think that they would, the state would have to take some responsibility and not leave it all in the hands of Eastham.
Bill, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. We can look into that. Certainly there's state and federal culpability and a whole host of wastewater problems across here. I think what's important that I reiterate is that the problem that we have across the region and problems that we have, whether it's in Town Cove or elsewhere, is driven largely by our Title V septic systems or worse, cesspools, and so that there is a need to provide sewer in many of our communities. Whether or not that is specifically in Eastham, I'm going to leave that up to Mass DEP and the town to really figure out. I think I would harken back to the earlier conversation around housing, and one way to build a heck of a lot more housing in a way that's indigenous to our communities and is a lot more dense is when you have a sewer. So I don't know the answer on Salt Pond. Bill, what we can do is we can reach out to Congressman Keating's office and see if there's an answer if that hasn't been done before, and certainly would want to have them participate in it. I do want to make clear that the wastewater problem broadly across the region is more of our doing from our effluent. Certainly, I think Salt Pond's a good example of issues where you have other issues coming into play, but we'll find out.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so the last topic in our letter was unfunded mandates, and in many ways, a lot of the discussion here in the last half hour is kind of leading to this topic. And Senator, I was just going to mention a few lead-in numbers that we have in the letter, and those of you in the audience should have that, which are quite important, especially given the comment that you made a minute ago about we will be required by the federal government to spend some pretty significant money. It would be significant to a town like Boston, let alone to a rural community, semi-rural community like Cape Cod. For the record, like many other towns in the state, Eastham has a very significant unfunded pension liability. At the end of 16, it was about $15 million. We also, again, like many others, we have unfunded OPEB benefits. That was about $24 million at the end of 14. It's a lot of money when you look at the size of the tax base that we have. But that pales in comparison to the very significant liability that we have for doing the right thing and putting in safe town-wide water, something that other towns haven't done. We tried to do it for many years. We finally did. That's a commitment of $134 million. The town's finances are extremely strong. The rating agencies are very happy with Eastham. Until recently, it had a AAA rating. It has recently gone down to AA+ with a positive outlook. That has nothing to do with changes in our finances. It has to do with a recognition that the debt levels are rising. Yeah. So suddenly, for whatever reason, for the federal government or anyone to come in and mandate that we pick up a piece of a massively expensive program that we all recognize we ought to be doing, it's the right thing to do, may or may not be feasible for Eastham, let alone other parts of the Cape. We're talking very, very big numbers. And at the end of the day, unless the federal government or the state or someone is going to make a lot of money available or give guarantees to rating agencies and banks and others, I think it's going to be very difficult realistically to do something. So if you just touch on that, and I think the other parts of this paragraph in the letter we've probably touched on, and at that point we're really close to the deadline that you gave us. So,
thank you, Mike. And by mandates, are you referencing wastewater or things more broadly?
Well, it's the likely mandate that's going to come down on,
Yep.
on
So-
both wastewater treatment, but also management of stormwater.
Yep.
And any other mandates, because we should also recognize that other things, this is the likely next big unfunded mandate. But I'm sure the state, the federal government, and others, if we sort of look, there is the potential for other things to come along as well.
Yes, so there's no currently state, well, on the wastewater piece, it's actually really through court action. That is, it's a threat of court action, and it's part of a settlement that is compelling our communities to act. So it's currently not the federal government or state government saying that we have to do anything. Frankly, I think the federal and state government were actually a little enabling for our communities in putting off this problem around wastewater and the nitrification of our embayments and the increase in phosphorus in our freshwater bodies of water that have only made the problem more expensive. So that I wouldn't describe it as a mandate. I'd describe it as a threat of court action, and that not doing anything not only does that continue to harm and degrade our environment and quality of life and all those good things, but also that potentially court-ordered action would be more expensive than what we pursue here. So I really believe that we have an interest to be more proactive around wastewater. What I've been really trying to do is figure out how do you bring more tools and more resources to communities like Eastham to deal with a whole host of things, but I think especially around wastewater. Because this is such a hefty chunk of money for all of our communities, and then if we don't get any support of it, it just falls back on our property tax base, which is particularly for people on fixed incomes, for folks who are land rich but cash poor. That doesn't add up. And I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier around solutions around wastewater and looking at expansion of room occupancy. Expansive room occupancy is going to provide a pretty significant amount of resources for Eastham, just with a local option. It's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is just additional money to the town budget. And then in addition to that, having a regional pool of money that municipalities can tap into for these wastewater projects, I think really would really help make a difference. That's not having the town have to go, using its own borrowing limit. It's using being able to rely on a state system to do that. What we've talked about is establishing a clean water trust that would pool resources to get this done for the region. Eastham, I think in Eastham, right, there is a conversation to be had among experts around what needs to be done around certain embayments, and is that through sewering, is that through other means, but certainly I think for the region, if we were able to get this done. And I'm increasingly confident that expansion of room occupancy will happen, and that we'll be able to tie some resources for wastewater to this, which is really, really good news for the region. And again, I really have to credit Sarah Peak, who's been working on this, for the 11 years she's been in the legislature. Her work, as well as Representative Cleon Turner, has really moved this issue. And I think that, 11, 12 years later, we are increasingly in a position that we're going to take this up and do this. And I think that's going to be really a significant win for just additional resources that flow to the towns through the people that are here, and then also monies for wastewater. So I think that, the more that, I understand, I mentioned earlier, sort of the reality of going to budget writers in Beacon Hill and advocating for communities that just on paper have the lowest property tax rates in the state is, can be a losing argument. But I think what I've really sought to do is say, all right, look, just, at least give us the resources to generate some revenue here within our own communities, and then keep it here. And so if we can do that, I think that hope that moves towards it. More broadly on unfunded liabilities, we've got a lot of these. I don't know how we as a Commonwealth, we as a country, figure this out. I don't know how my generation is able to sort of sustain a whole host of this stuff. But I do know a lot of really committed people who are working on it. I try to be really honest about, that it's definitely an issue and something that I think I'm concerned about. I do think it's important that we continue to really invest in, everything from education and to our healthcare system, to improvements on Route 6. But this is a challenge I think that we have everywhere, and you know, broadly the communities I represent, and Eastham's included in this, have done a good job in fiscal stewardship, and so have good bond ratings, have involved citizenry, and I think that that's helpful for us. But it's certainly something that there's no sort of long-term easy answers to, and I regret that. I hope we come up with them, because I really worry that we're gonna, if you look at where we're going demographically, if you look at what the needs that we have in our communities, I think broadly we've got to change how we're doing business for this all to add up. But that's we can talk about that next year when I come back. But you know, I just want to say, are there any questions from the panel? I don't know, Brendan, I don't know if you had any questions or comments or want to talk about what you've been up to at Nauset. Always not to put you on the spot at all, but I think it's important. I'm a big believer that folks who serve on these boards need to hear from the young folks in our community, so.
Well, I guess just to add on about what to add on to what you're talking about Route 6, I would say that as I just got my permit a couple months ago, so as a new driver, Route 6 is a very daunting experience. I'd say that
Take the back roads, yeah.
I take back roads. My mom won't let me take a left-hand turn, so I think for new drivers, just making sure it's more clear on which way you should probably be going under 6 I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think I'm just not.
My mom doesn't want me to make left-hand turns in Route 6 either, if it makes it feel any better.
But I think that what you guys were talking about making it more narrow, a 2-lane highway would make it a lot easier to drive on.
Yeah, I think there's, I think this DCPC is going to provide a real opportunity to look at it in a holistic way. And, you know, in response to the, what is it called? I don't know, an unossified bureaucracy that may or may not be MassDOT, that having a laid out plan, I think, is helpful in saying, all right, here's a whole list of things that we could do to make this better. You know, the challenge, I think, is getting it on the funding piece, and that the TIP process is not a speedy one. It's a very lengthy one. Getting it at what's called the TIP, basically the list of projects that we're going to do. The good news is Sarah Peak's really experienced at getting some of this stuff done, so I'm going to just piggyback alongside with her and try to move that forward. But, you know, I think the more, you know, also too, like youth participation, you can get into that as well. And just talking about how do you tie this all together from an infrastructure perspective. And good luck with your driving. Thank you. It's when you grow up on the Outer Cape and you get your driver's license, it's sort of like it's a pretty significant day in your life, because all of a sudden you have a freedom that
Actually go somewhere.
yeah, and your parents don't have to schlep you to your friend's house who lives in West Brewster or something. But are there other questions in the audience at all, or?
There we go. Thank you. One question. I didn't hear anything about imputed milestones in the court ordering. I'm gathering there are none. You don't have any milestones to accomplish at these water. There are no.
Legislative accomplishments?
There are no formal accomplishments under the court ordering for the watering. There is no direct order timeframes.
Oh, so under the court order around wastewater, there is a time frame under the 208 plan. This was part of a settlement that was reached across all the communities, and I believe it's 5 years. The Cape Cod Commission is really the experts here as far as what the timing of it is. Eastham is on the list of communities with big problems, and even in Bayman areas with big problems. You folks are lower on the list than, you know, even your neighbor down the street in Orleans or Denison Yarmouth and Barnstable and Mashpee. But, you know, I think that it's the Conservation Law Foundation that brought the suit. There was a One Cape Summit meeting in June, I believe, with many of the selectmen, and CLF basically, you know, said, we're putting you on notice, we're watching this. If we don't see progress, we're going to go back into court. So, I think we're talking about several years. I think there has been progress that's been made. I think, and if we're able to get this Clean Water Trust through, it'll be very significant progress, and I think may eliminate the threat of that court order, and which is something I think that, as a delegation, we're hoping to get done.
Okay. So Senator, on behalf of the town of Eastham, we'd not only like to thank you for spending your evening with us, we're only 10 minutes after our deadline, but also to thank you for jumping in with both feet. You're just finishing your first year in this new role. It's obvious, if we look at the legislation that you've initiated, the things that you've done, you have been amazingly quick to get involved and make an impact. So again, on behalf of the town, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that just leaves, does anyone have a motion?
Make a motion to adjourn.
Have a motion, have a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Supposed to say auf Wiedersehen.
Sleep.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Sleep. Good night.